A thick November fog had descended upon London when the telegram arrived at Baker Street. I was engaged in reviewing my medical journal, while Holmes sat absorbed in his chemical experiments, the acrid smell of sulfur compounds filling our sitting room. Mrs. Hudson brought up the yellow envelope with evident relief at having an excuse to open a window. Holmes read the message and immediately set aside his test tubes. "Watson," he said, his gray eyes gleaming with interest. "We have been summoned by Sir James Worthington of Worthington and Sons, one of London's most prestigious private banks. It seems there has been a robbery of a most peculiar nature. He requests our immediate attendance at his residence in Mayfair." I consulted my watch. It was 10:30 in the morning. "What makes this robbery peculiar?" Holmes passed me the telegram. "The safe was opened, apparently by someone who knew the combination. Yet nothing appears to have been taken. Sir James describes it as an empty safe that should not be empty, yet contains nothing stolen. A pretty puzzle, wouldn't you say?" Before I detail the remarkable events that followed, permit me to address those who find enjoyment in these chronicles of detection and mystery. If these accounts bring any measure of entertainment or instruction to your days, I would be grateful if you might support our endeavors through a simple subscription, a like, or by sharing these tales with others who appreciate the art of deduction and the pursuit of truth. Such kindness ensures these stories reach those who value them. With that courtesy extended, let us proceed to the mystery of the banker's empty safe. Within the hour, we had taken a cab to Sir James Worthington's townhouse in Mayfair. The residence was substantial, built in the Georgian style with an air of understated wealth appropriate to a man of finance. We were shown immediately to Sir James's private study, a room lined with legal volumes and financial ledgers. The banker himself was a man of perhaps 60 years, silver-haired and distinguished, though at present his usual composure was clearly shaken. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming so promptly. I find myself in a situation that defies all reason." Holmes settled into the offered chair with that focused attention he brought to every new case. "Pray, tell us everything, Sir James. When did you discover the irregularity?" Sir James rose and crossed to a substantial safe built into the wall behind an oil painting of a ship at sea. The safe door stood open, revealing empty shelves within. "This morning at 8 o'clock, when I came to retrieve certain documents I needed for a business meeting. The safe was unlocked, Mr. Holmes. Not forced, not damaged, but simply unlocked, as though by someone who possessed the proper combination. And what should have been inside? Bearer bonds to the value of £50,000, several important legal contracts, and certain private papers of a sensitive nature. All gone. Yet nothing else in the house has been disturbed. The servants report no signs of intrusion. It is as though a phantom entered, opened the safe with perfect knowledge, and vanished with its contents. Holmes examined the safe with his magnifying glass, studying the lock mechanism, the interior shelves, and the surrounding wall. This is a Chubb detector lock, I observe, one of the finest mechanisms available. It cannot be picked without leaving obvious traces. Tell me, Sir James, who knows the combination to this safe? Only myself and my son Edward. He is a partner in the firm and naturally has access to critical documents. Where is your son now? Sir James's expression clouded. That is part of what troubles me, Mr. Holmes. Edward did not come home last night. He sent a message saying he would be staying at his club. But when I inquired there this morning, they informed me he had...
When did you last see your son?
Yesterday evening, here in this study. We had a disagreement about business matters. Edward wished to invest firm capital in a speculative railway venture in South America. I refused, as I considered the risk too great. He was angry when he left. But surely he would not. Sir James's voice trailed off, unable to complete the terrible thought. Holmes continued his examination. The painting that conceals the safe, was it replaced in its usual position? Yes, exactly as it always hangs. And the room shows no signs of disturbance. Papers in order, furniture unmoved. Nothing. It is as though the thief knew precisely where to go and what to do. Holmes crossed to the window and examined the sill and frame. This window was opened recently. See here, Watson, the fresh scratches on the latch. I joined him and observed the marks he indicated. Could someone have entered through the window? Possibly, though we are on the second floor. It would require considerable agility and nerve. Holmes turned back to Sir James. Tell me about your household staff. How many servants do you employ? A butler, a housekeeper, a cook, 2 housemaids and a footman. All have been with me for years. I would trust them with my life. Nevertheless, I should like to interview them. Watson, perhaps you would be so kind as to make notes. The servants were summoned one by one. The butler, Simmons, was a dignified man of perhaps 50 years who had served the household for 2 decades. He reported nothing unusual during the night, though he admitted his quarters were at the rear of the house and he was a deep sleeper. The housekeeper, Mrs. Blackwell, was equally emphatic that no stranger could have entered without her knowledge. It was the footman, a young man named Thomas Greaves, who provided the first significant detail. Begging your pardon, sir. I was passing Master Edward's room around 9 o'clock when I heard voices. He was arguing with someone, though I couldn't make out who. Holmes leaned forward. Could you distinguish anything about this other voice? Male or female? Young or old? Male, sir, and roughly Master Edward's age, I'd say. The voice was educated, though there was an edge to it, if you understand my meaning. Aggressive, like. Did you see this person arrive or depart? No, sir. I assumed he must have come earlier in the evening, when I was occupied with my duties. Holmes questioned each servant thoroughly about their movements and observations. When they had been dismissed, he turned to Sir James. "I shall need to examine your son's room, and I should like a list of his close associates, particularly anyone who might know about the contents of your safe." Edward's chambers revealed a young man of expensive tastes. Fine clothing filled the wardrobe, racing prints adorned the walls, and several bills from tailors and wine merchants lay upon the desk. Holmes examined these with interest. "Your son lives beyond his means, Sir James. These debts are substantial." Sir James's face colored with embarrassment. "Edward has always had extravagant habits. I provide him with a generous allowance, but he constantly exceeds it. We have argued about this repeatedly." Among the papers on the desk, Holmes discovered a letter that made him pause. He read it carefully, then passed it to me. It was from a gentleman named Marcus Ashford, written in an educated but forceful hand, demanding repayment of gambling debts to the sum of £3,000. The letter concluded with a barely veiled threat regarding consequences should payment not be forthcoming. "Do you know this, Marcus Ashford?" Holmes asked. Sir James nodded grimly. "He is a gambler and a scoundrel who preys on young men with more money than sense. Edward mentioned him once or twice. I warned him to stay away from such company, but I fear my warnings went unheeded." Holmes pocketed the letter. "I should like to call upon Mr. Ashford. Do you know where he might be found?" "He keeps rooms near St. James's, I believe." "But Mr. Holmes, surely you don't think Edward would steal from his own father to pay gambling debts?" "I think nothing as yet, Sir James. I merely follow where the evidence leads." We departed the Worthington residence with Holmes in that state of intense mental activity I had learned to recognize. In the cab, he sat in silence, his fingers steepled, his eyes half closed. At length he spoke. "Watson, we have several curious features to consider. First, the safe was opened by someone who knew the combination. Second, Edward Worthington is missing and has substantial debts. Third, a stranger was heard arguing with Edward on the very evening before the theft. Fourth, nothing else in the house was disturbed. What do you make of it?" I considered the facts. It seems clear that Edward took the bonds to pay his debts to this Ashford fellow. Perhaps Ashford pressured him during their argument last night. A reasonable hypothesis, Holmes acknowledged. But consider this. If Edward simply wished to steal from his father's safe, why do so on a night when he had been heard arguing with a stranger? Why not wait for a time when suspicion would be less likely to fall upon him? No, Watson. There is something more here. The theft was either more calculated than it appears, or less voluntary than we might assume. We made our way to the address Sir James had provided for Marcus Ashford. The building was respectable, but showed signs of genteel decay. The landlady, a sharp-faced woman, directed us to the first floor. "Mr. Ashford went out early this morning with a large case. Looked like he was going traveling though he paid his rent through the end of the month. Strange that.
And the bed was unmade.
Holmes examined everything with meticulous care. In a wastepaper basket, he found a torn railway schedule and a receipt from a shipping company for passage to Calais, departing that very afternoon. "He's fleeing to the continent," Holmes said grimly. "Watson, we must reach Victoria Station immediately. If Ashford boards that ferry, he will be beyond our reach." We engaged a cab and drove with all speed to Victoria. The station was crowded with travelers, but Holmes moved through the throng with purpose toward the Calais platform. As we approached, I spotted a well-dressed man of perhaps 30 years standing beside a large leather case, consulting his pocket watch nervously. "Mr. Ashford, I presume," Holmes said, approaching him directly. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and I have questions regarding your association with Edward Worthington." Ashford's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about. I have no obligation to speak with you." He made to move toward the platform, but Holmes blocked his path. "You may speak with me now, or with the police in a matter of minutes. The choice is yours." Ashford's resolve crumbled. "Very well, but not here. Somewhere private." We repaired to a small tea room off the main concourse. Once seated, Holmes fixed Ashford with that penetrating stare I had seen him use so effectively. "Mr. Ashford, Edward Worthington's father has been robbed. Bearer bonds worth £50,000 were stolen from his safe last night. You were heard arguing with Edward yesterday evening. This morning you are fleeing to France. The connections are not difficult to draw." "I didn't steal anything," Ashford protested. "Yes, Edward owed me money. Yes, I went to his house last night to demand payment. But I never touched any safe. I never even knew there was a safe." "What transpired during your argument?" "Edward said he couldn't pay me immediately, but would have the money within a few days."
I told him that wasn't acceptable. I may have threatened him with exposure to his father if he didn't settle the debt. We argued for perhaps 20 minutes, and then I left. "At what time did you depart?" "Shortly after 9 o'clock. I took a cab directly to my rooms." "Can anyone confirm this?" Ashford shook his head. "I was alone for the remainder of the evening. But, Mr. Holmes, I swear I had nothing to do with any robbery. Why would I flee if I were innocent? Because I feared I would be suspected. That's why. When I heard this morning that Sir James had sent for the famous Sherlock Holmes, I panicked." Holmes studied him for a long moment. "I believe you, Mr. Ashford. You are a gambler and perhaps not entirely scrupulous in your business dealings. But you are no thief. The theft required inside knowledge and calm execution. Your flight to France was that of a frightened man, not a calculating criminal." Ashford sagged with relief. "Then I am free to go?" "Not quite. You will return with us to Sir James Worthington and provide a full account of your dealings with Edward. After that you may do as you please, though I suggest remaining in England would better serve your interests." Reluctantly, Ashford agreed.
We returned to Mayfair, where Sir James received Ashford coldly, but listened to his account. When Ashford had finished explaining the gambling debts and his argument with Edward, Sir James dismissed him with a curt instruction to never darken his doorway again. "So, if Ashford is innocent," Sir James said wearily, "then where is Edward, and where are my bonds?" "I believe your son is in danger, Sir James," Holmes said gravely. "The evidence suggests he did not steal from you willingly. Someone forced his hand, someone who knew about the safe and Edward's desperate need for money. Watson, we must visit Edward's club immediately." The porter confirmed that Edward Worthington had indeed been there the previous evening, but had departed around 11 o'clock in company with another gentleman. "He seemed agitated, sir, not himself at all. The gentleman who accompanied him was insistent they leave together." "Can you describe this companion?" Holmes asked. The porter frowned. "Tall, well-dressed, dark-haired. Spoke with a slight accent, though I couldn't place it. He claimed to be an old school friend of Mr. Worthington's." Holmes thanked the porter and turned to me as we stepped outside. "Watson, I begin to see the outline of this affair. Edward was coerced into opening the safe, almost certainly at gunpoint or under threat of violence. The thief was someone who knew about Edward's debts and used them as leverage. Someone who had been watching the household and learning its routines. But who? And where is Edward now? That, my dear fellow, is what we must discover before it is too late. Come, we have one more call to make." Holmes directed our cab to the offices of Worthington & Sons in the city. The building was impressive, its marble facade speaking of generations of financial success. Holmes requested to see the head clerk, a Mr. Pemberton, who received us in a panelled office filled with ledgers. "Mr. Pemberton, I am investigating a matter concerning Edward Worthington. Can you tell me if he has had any new business associates recently? Anyone who might have taken an unusual interest in the firm's affairs?" Pemberton considered this carefully. "There was a gentleman who called here several times over the past month. Said he represented South American mining interests and wished to discuss investment opportunities. Mr. Edward met with him privately on several occasions. Do you recall this gentleman's name?" "He gave it as Senor Rodriguez, though I cannot say whether that was genuine. He had the bearing of a military man and spoke English perfectly, despite his accent." Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden understanding. "What did this Senor Rodriguez look like?" "Tall, dark-haired, perhaps 40 years of age, quite distinguished in appearance." "Thank you, Mr. Pemberton. You have been most helpful." Outside the bank, Holmes gripped my arm with urgency. "Watson, Edward has been duped by a confidence trickster of considerable skill. This Rodriguez learned of Edward's financial difficulties and his authority to access the safe. He presented himself as a legitimate businessman while actually planning the robbery. The gambling debts to Ashford provided the perfect pressure point. Rodriguez threatened to expose Edward unless he cooperated in the theft. But where are they now? If I am correct, Rodriguez took Edward with him as insurance against pursuit. He will hold him until he is safely away with the bonds. We must determine where Rodriguez is likely to have gone.
A man fleeing England with stolen bearer bonds worth £50,000 has limited options. He cannot simply present them at a London bank without arousing suspicion. Holmes pulled out his pipe and lit it, pacing as he thought. He would need to convert them abroad or through an intermediary who asks no questions. Watson, there is a notorious receiver of stolen goods who operates from the docks in Limehouse. If Rodriguez intends to liquidate the bonds quickly, he might attempt to sell them there at a discount. It is worth investigating. We took a cab to Limehouse, entering that warren of narrow streets and questionable establishments near the river. Holmes led us to a dilapidated warehouse where he knocked upon an iron door. After a tense moment, it opened to reveal a wizened Chinese gentleman who regarded us with shrewd eyes. Holmes spoke to him in what I assumed was Cantonese, and the man responded with a stream of rapid words. He says a European gentleman matching Rodriguez's description was here 2 hours ago, attempting to sell bearer bonds. However, they could not agree on price. Rodriguez became angry and left, saying he would try elsewhere. Holmes thanked the man, and we hurried back to the street. Watson, there are perhaps 3 other places in London where Rodriguez might attempt such a transaction. We must move quickly. At the second location, a pawn shop in Whitechapel, we found what we sought. Through the grimy window, I could see a tall, dark-haired man arguing with the shopkeeper over papers spread upon the counter. Holmes pushed open the door and stepped inside. Senor Rodriguez, or whatever your true name may be, you are under arrest for theft and kidnapping. The man spun around, his hand moving toward his coat pocket, but Holmes was faster. I would not advise it. Dr. Watson's service revolver is pointed at your chest, and he is an excellent shot. I had indeed drawn my weapon and held it steady. Rodriguez assessed the situation and slowly raised his hands. You have no authority to arrest me. Perhaps not, but the officers of Scotland Yard who will be here momentarily most certainly do. I sent word to Inspector Lestrade from our last stop. Ah, I believe I hear their approach now. The sound of police whistles filled the street outside. Within moments, Lestrade and 3 constables entered the shop. Mr. Holmes, you said I would find something interesting here. I see you are not exaggerating. Inspector, this man has stolen £50,000 in bearer bonds from Sir James Worthington. You will also find Edward Worthington being held against his will somewhere nearby. I suggest you ask this gentleman where he has hidden him. Under questioning, Rodriguez sullenly revealed that Edward was locked in a storage room above a tavern 3 streets away. Constables were dispatched and returned shortly with Edward, shaken but unharmed. As Holmes recounted the case to a grateful Sir James Worthington and his son, I marveled once again at his deductive powers. How did you know to look in Limehouse? I asked, when father and son had departed. Holmes smiled. Rodriguez made one critical error, Watson. When he fled Edward's club with him at 11 o'clock, he was already in possession of the bonds from the safe. That meant the safe had been opened earlier in the evening, most likely while the argument with Ashford provided a convenient distraction and established Edward
as a suspect. Rodriguez then forced Edward to accompany him while he attempted to liquidate the bonds. But bearer bonds of that value are difficult to sell quickly without arousing suspicion. That limited his options significantly. The rest was simply a matter of checking the likely locations and finding him before he could escape London entirely. And Edward's cooperation in opening the safe? Obtained through threats, as I suspected. Rodriguez told Edward that if he did not cooperate, information about his gambling debts would be sent to his father, along with forged evidence suggesting Edward had embezzled from the firm. Faced with certain ruin, Edward complied, not realizing he was sealing his own fate. Rodriguez never intended to simply take the bonds and disappear. He needed Edward as a hostage until he could safely leave the country. A wicked scheme, I observed. Indeed, but foiled by attention to detail and logical deduction. The banker's empty safe is now empty no longer, and justice has been served. Holmes reached for his violin, and as he began to play a contemplative air, I reflected that another mystery had been solved through the singular talents of my remarkable friend. The case of the banker's empty safe remained a topic of conversation between Holmes and myself for several days following its resolution.
Not only for the recovery of the bonds, but for saving his son from a situation that might well have ended in tragedy. Edward, chastened by his narrow escape, had sworn off gambling and dedicated himself to rebuilding his father's trust through diligent work at the firm. One evening, as we sat before the fire in our Baker Street rooms, I found myself reflecting on the various elements of the case. "Holmes," I said, breaking the comfortable silence, "there is one aspect that still puzzles me. How did you know that Rodriguez had Edward held captive, rather than simply having abandoned him after the theft?" Holmes set down the chemical journal he had been perusing and regarded me with that slight smile that indicated he had been expecting the question. "Several factors pointed to that conclusion, Watson. First, consider Rodriguez's character as revealed by his actions. He was a careful planner who had spent weeks establishing a false identity and cultivating Edward's trust. Such a man does not leave loose ends. Edward could identify him, describe him to the police, and provide details about his methods. Rodriguez could not afford to simply let him go. But why not simply dispose of him entirely? I asked, though the thought was grim. Too risky. A murder investigation would have brought far more scrutiny than a simple theft. Moreover, Rodriguez needed time to liquidate the bonds and arrange his escape. Keeping Edward alive as a hostage provided insurance. If he were apprehended, he could use Edward as a bargaining chip. If he managed to escape successfully, he could release Edward later with no additional risk to himself. I nodded, seeing the logic. "And your certainty that he would attempt to sell the bonds in Limehouse?" "Ah, that required some knowledge of the London underworld," Holmes acknowledged.
Bearer bonds are peculiar instruments, Watson. They are valuable precisely because they require no proof of ownership. Whoever possesses them can redeem them, but that very quality makes them suspicious when presented in large quantities. No legitimate bank would accept £50,000 in bearer bonds from a stranger without extensive questions about their provenance. So Rodriguez needed to sell them to someone who wouldn't ask questions, I observed. Precisely. And such individuals are found in predictable locations. Limehouse, Whitechapel, certain establishments near the docks. These are places where stolen goods flow through the shadows of commerce. I have cultivated contacts in these areas over the years. They provide information in exchange for my discretion regarding their less serious transgressions. It is a mutually beneficial arrangement. One might call it an unusual relationship with the criminal element, I remarked. Holmes chuckled. Perhaps. But the pursuit of justice sometimes requires walking in gray areas, Watson. The world is not divided into absolute good and absolute evil. There are many shades between, and effective detection requires understanding them all. I considered the character of Rodriguez, or whatever his true name might have been. Do you think he was truly a South American businessman at any point? Or was the entire identity fabricated? Almost certainly fabricated, Holmes replied. The accent was likely genuine. He probably had spent time in South America, but I doubt he had any legitimate business interests. Men like Rodriguez are professional confidence tricksters. They study their marks, learn what vulnerabilities they possess, and exploit them ruthlessly. Edward Worthington, with his gambling debts and access to his father's safe, was an ideal target. Young Worthington was fortunate you became involved when you did. Indeed. Another few hours, and Rodriguez might have successfully converted enough of the bonds to fund his escape. The Continental ferry would have carried him beyond our immediate reach, and tracking him thereafter would have been considerably more difficult. The speed with which we moved from clue to clue was essential. I refilled my glass from the decanter on the side table and settled back into my chair. The fire crackled pleasantly, and the sounds of evening traffic on Baker Street provided a familiar backdrop to our conversation. Tell me, Holmes, what did you make of the father and son's relationship? Sir James seemed genuinely anguished when he thought his son might have betrayed him. Holmes's expression became more thoughtful. That was perhaps the most interesting aspect of the entire affair from a psychological standpoint. Sir James is a man who built his fortune through caution, discipline, and conservative financial management. His son, raised in wealth, never learned those hard lessons. The tension between them, the father's disappointment in the son's extravagance, the son's resentment of the father's control, that was fertile ground for a manipulator like Rodriguez to exploit. Do you think Edward will reform his habits? I asked. That remains to be seen. Fear is a powerful motivator in the short term, but whether it produces lasting change depends on the individual's character. Edward has been given a second chance. Whether he takes advantage of it will be revealed in time. I advised Sir James to involve Edward more directly in the firm's operations, to give him real responsibility and the opportunity to prove himself. Idle hands and minds are the devil's workshop, as the saying goes. The clock on the mantel chimed the hour,
and Holmes rose to replenish his pipe from the tobacco kept in the Persian slipper on the shelf. As he did so, he continued his reflections. "You know, Watson, cases like this one remind me why I chose this profession. It would have been easy enough to conclude that Edward had simply stolen from his father to pay his debts. The superficial evidence pointed in that direction, but the careful observer notices the details that don't quite fit. The timing of the theft, the argument with Ashford that seemed almost designed to create suspicion, the missing son, who could have easily fled before we began our investigation, but who instead vanished completely. Each anomaly was a thread, I observed, and you pulled on them until the whole tapestry unraveled to reveal the truth beneath." "A poetic way of describing the deductive method," Holmes said with approval, "but essentially accurate. The truth is always there, Watson, hidden among the false trails and misdirections. One simply needs the patience to separate the signal from the noise, the relevant from the irrelevant." We fell into a companionable silence, each lost in our own thoughts about the case and its implications. Outside, the November fog that had begun the day continued to shroud London in its gray embrace, muffling sound and obscuring vision. But within our rooms, all was clear and warm, and I felt that satisfaction that comes from seeing justice done and innocence preserved. The banker's empty safe had been refilled. A son had been saved from both physical danger and moral ruin, and a clever criminal had been brought to justice. It was, all things considered, a successful resolution to a complex affair. "Holmes," I said, breaking the silence once more, "you mentioned that Rodriguez likely had genuine experience in South America. Will the authorities there be notified?" "Inspector Lestrade assures me that international telegrams will be sent to various police forces on the continent and in South America. Rodriguez's true identity will eventually emerge, and with it, likely a trail of similar confidence schemes. Men like him rarely commit only one crime. They leave a pattern wherever they go. This may be the thread that unravels his entire criminal history." "One can hope," I said, "that his other victims may yet find some measure of justice as well." "Indeed, though I suspect many of his marks never realized they had been duped, or were too embarrassed to admit it publicly. That is the particular evil of the confidence trickster, Watson. They trade on human weakness, greed, vanity, desperation, and their victims often feel complicit in their own victimization." The evening wore on, and our conversation drifted to other topics and other cases. But the mystery of the banker's empty safe had been satisfactorily resolved, and as I later recorded the details in my journal, I reflected that it stood as an excellent example of Holmes's methods and the vital importance of distinguishing appearance from reality. What had seemed a straightforward case of familial betrayal had proven to be something far more complex and sinister. And only through careful observation and logical deduction had the truth emerged. It was, I thought, a case worth chronicling among the many adventures I had shared with Sherlock Holmes.